Okay, looks like we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Atlas Project. My name is Ben Bayer. I'm a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and this is episode 12 of the Atlas Project. We took a week off last week for Thanksgiving and for the fact that Greg was traveling in Europe. While he was there, he did have the chance to do a supplementary broadcast on the topic of Francisco's money speech, which we'll talk about a little bit more tonight as well, because we're talking about chapter 2 of part 2, the Aristocracy of Pull, which contains that speech, but a lot of other things too. So to get things started, let me turn things over to Greg in New York, where he will give us a summary of the events.
I have to put my mic on. So as Ben said, we're on part 2, chapter 2. I can see people are coming online and starting to watch. We're up to, in the 20s, we usually get into the 70s or 80s, so I expect people will be coming on over the next few minutes. The main event of this chapter is, the titles didn't switch off as they came to me, they were supposed to. Okay, the main event of this chapter, of course, is the wedding of Jim Taggart to Cheryl Brooks, and there are a lot of important encounters that go on at that wedding. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. Of course, that's where the famous money speech is given, and a number of other things happen at the wedding as well. An important encounter between Daphne and Lillian, conversation between Riordan and Francisco, and a few other significant conversations, one between Daphne and Francisco. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about that, but there are a few events described earlier in the chapter that we should at least note before we do that. So first, there's we see Daphne at the beginning of the chapter wondering about all the disappearances, and we see her forming the idea, or that she's formed the idea, that it's as though a conscious destroyer was deliberately going through the country, causing all these people to disappear. We see Daphne hire Quentin Daniels, who's the physicist that Robert Stadler suggested to her, as somebody who might be able to rebuild the motor she found in the abandoned factory, and we learn a little bit about that. We get a flashback where we're shown the development of Jim and Cheryl's relationship. We saw their first meeting in the chapter, I guess, chapter 9, but book part 1, chapter 9. But we haven't seen them since then, and now it's their wedding, so we get to see what transpired in between. And there's we also see a scene in which Riordan and Ken Danker have a meeting in Riordan's hotel room. And they make a deal whereby Riordan is going to illegally sell Danker metal that he can use to reinforce coal mines. And Ben, any thoughts about this scene? I know we wanted to say about it.
The Danker scene?
Yeah. I mean, there's the issue of it's an illegal sale, and we get some of both Riordan and Danker's attitude towards that illegality and the kind of risks they're running.
Well, I think I don't want to say too much about it just yet, because I think we're going to have the occasion to refer back to it when we talk about the money speech itself, because there's some ways in which that illustrates certain points that Francisco makes there. Also, there's a major kind of development in Riordan's thinking about morality, which I think is at least hinted at in certain parts of this scene between Riordan and Danker. But I didn't have more than that. I think it'd be preliminary to get into that now. Unless you wanted me to talk about the... well, I didn't hear you mention the last point on the outline yet, so I wasn't sure. Can't hear you, Mike.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. There are a few interesting points. I mean, there's why they're each doing this. Danker is expanding his business quickly. He's not making a profit expanding his business this way. And he says he's doing it because he doesn't dare leave the railroads, leave Taggart Transcontinental without coal. And he's not sure why he cares about that, but he does. And that's an interesting an interesting fact. I mean, it's Riordan and Danker are these cold-hearted businessmen who are out for their own profit, and yet they're not really profiting. And it seems like they're doing it to keep the economy afloat. And in Danker's case, he's not sure why he, as he puts it, still cares about that, as though, they all seem to be on the premise of, though society's dying anyway, there's nothing we can do about it. So I find that interesting. They're now willing to run this horrible risk of an illegal deal that they could go to jail for, to do something where they're not actually profiting from it, but they're maybe helping to keep the country afloat. And there's the fact that Riordan, they talk about what would happen if they got caught, right, and what they would do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later maybe, but there's the idea that Danker says he would pay blackmail, if it was from a private employee, but not from a government official. And Riordan says, you mean either, in that case, we both go to jail. They agreed. And Riordan has this thought that it's, when he was younger, he would never do anything illegal. He wouldn't steal a piece of fruit when he was starving. But now, the thought of going to jail just leaves him cold, like it's like some accident that might happen. There's no moral significance. So that's interesting. And he's reflecting, I think maybe, Ben, this is the scene you had in mind. He's reflecting at the end on the fact that this is the only business transaction he's enjoyed in a year. And this is the bit that you have a passage on, right, Ben?
Yeah, page 384 of the standard edition, I find interesting, and I'm going to have occasion to come back to it later in our discussion, so I'll give it to people now. He thought that he had been made to hide as a guilty secret the only business transaction he had enjoyed in a year's work, and that he was hiding as a guilty secret his nights with Daphne, the only hours that kept him alive. He felt that there was some connection between the two secrets, some essential connection which he had to discover. He could not grasp it, he could not find the words to name it, but he felt that the day when he would find them, he would answer every question of his life. And there have been a number of scenes previously in the book where there's been a discussion about Riordan's having the words to say certain things that are important. And one figure in particular says he wants to give Riordan the words, and maybe we're going to get that pretty soon in this chapter.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to this.
Yeah, good. Good. So with that, let's just switch over to talking about the wedding. And a first observation about the wedding, and we'll come back later at the end of today, if we have time, which we should, to talking about the lead up to the wedding and Jim and Cheryl's relationship. But let's focus on the wedding itself. So one interesting characteristic of it is it's a political event, right? It's a political event. There's a subtext and a political subtext to everything that's going on there. And this is something, Ben, that came up a lot in the discussion. We had asked one of the discussion questions about, in chapter 1, we had noticed this issue of characters either avoiding naming certain facts that they didn't want to face, or on the other hand, boldly naming those facts. And we asked, where do we see that happening in this chapter? I think we see it quite a lot. And a lot of the examples that we got of this, and that we expected this would be the case, pertain to this kind of political character of the wedding. Ben, do you want to bring in some of those?
Yeah, a number of people noticed interesting things here. So, for example, Lisa pointed out that both Lisa and Maria pointed out ways in which characters were revealing the fact that this was a nose-counting event, which is what Francisco later calls it, but they don't want to quite put it in those terms themselves. So, for example, Lisa says that Orrin Boyle and Bertram Scudder survey the crowd to see what people they will be able to take advantage of because of fear, and others they get favors from. Neither one admits this to themselves. And Maria directs us to a quote, which I found on page 393 of the Standard Edition, that they were men who used words as a public instrument to be avoided in the privacy of one's own mind. words were a commitment carrying implications which they did not wish to face. They needed to know words for their chart. Their classification was done by physical means, and the physical means here are, so or well. One corresponds to fear, one corresponds to favor. Those were the main ones I wanted to. Oh, and then there was Corey, who pointed out, well, this is less to do with the political character of the event itself, though at least not too indirectly connected, because it comes out eventually when Francisco shows up that Francisco is discussing with James about Danconia Copper, and he refers to the fact that James is one of his biggest stockholders, and Corey points out that this is something that Taggart wants to keep under wraps. It doesn't want it to be named, doesn't want it to be made known that there's so many other investors among his friends even that are at this party. There's a few other things about that where prominent characters are not. Oh well, let me do one more, and this was one that I noticed on page 405. I mean, so there's been a whole discussion between James and Orrin Boyle about basically about who's got more power. And there's a discussion about Mouch. Why hasn't Mouch shown up to the party? And there's an implication that at least Orrin Boyle is leaving us to draw that he had something to do with Mouch not being at the party. And this is a bit embarrassing to James, because James thought that he had Mouch in his pocket, but Boyle says, well, you did, but then the kind of person who is so easy to buy off is easily bought off by other people. And this may be something we can come back to later, but since so much of this party, as we'll discover, is about who is kowtowing to James, it's then pretty significant when Francisco comes in and starts humiliating James, say by mentioning that all these, that James is one of Francisco's biggest owners of stock. James is humiliated that he's now losing. He seems to be, everybody around him who's supposed to be coming to him to supplicate is now looking at him have to kind of supplicate to Francisco. And we get that on page 405, watching nervously, Taggart felt relief and a touch of nameless resentment, which if named would have told him he wished the occasion deserved the grandeur that Francisco's manner gave it for a moment.
There are a few things going on here, I think, that are interesting. So Francisco deflates the pretensions of the event and Taggart's importance. And I think that's a little bit of a different thing, though it's related to Francisco's giving the event a grandeur it doesn't have. But it's when Francisco's deflating James that the people who were previously cowering before James, they chuckle. They like to see James one-upped, even though they hate Francisco as much or more than Jim does. And that's an interesting factor. The issue of Francisco giving the event the grandeur that Jim wished it deserved is, I think, a little different. But there's something Francisco, the way he wears his formal clothes, makes it look like everybody else is just masquerading, right? Like he's someone who belongs in this environment and has the grace of it. And of course, Jim doesn't have that. What, Ben?
I read the wrong passage. I meant to read the one that came right before it, where it had a clearer connection to my earlier point. Sorry about that. Taggart knew that the men who had crawled at his feet a moment ago, whose hatred for Francisco was perhaps greater than his own, were enjoying the spectacle nonetheless. The implications of this knowledge were among the things he did not care to name. That's the one I meant. Where the implication is that he's losing the battle here to show how powerful he is.
Yeah, and here's another case of there's that implication that he's losing the battle to show how powerful he is, but also the what kind of a thing it is that he's getting from these people, that are supplicating him, so to speak. A few things that came up on the discussion. How do you pronounce the guy's name, Wesley Mouch or Mooch? It's definitely Mouch. It's meant to sound like between mouse and mooch. At least that's the lore that that people who knew Rand have said, and she definitely pronounced it Mouch. And Al, who was here some weeks ago, said that there were that she had mentioned when somebody asked her about it. Well, haven't you heard of the Mouch brothers, who were apparently some vaudeville act? So this is apparently a known name. One other little thing about Wesley Mouch's not coming, Ben. I don't think the issue there. Mouch isn't somebody who Jim bribed, right? And then maybe Boyles bribed him more. Mouch is someone who he was blackmailing, right? And he says the ones that you pay for, somebody could always pay them more. The issue with Mouch was that Jim had, as Boyle explains in this scene where he's being very brusque and naming everything kind of rudely in a way that makes Jim feel uncomfortable. It's interesting that Boyle is more willing to face and name what they each both do than Jim is. When you get the goods on a guy, then there's no higher bidder, and the goods that Jim had on Mouch was that Mouch double-crossed Riordan as part of this deal they all did back in Chapter 3, right? And Jim had written evidence of it. And so Mouch didn't want that to come out. But Boyle said eventually the scandal grows so old that it's not going to matter anymore, and maybe that's what's happening. And one interesting thing to think about, I don't think we should really talk about it more here, but just to think about is Jim asks Boyle, are you the one who made Wesley not come? And he says, I'll let you work that out. It's good for me if I did, right? Good for him because that shows he has the political power and the clout over Mouch, who's basically the almost dictator of the economy at this point, to do it. But even better for me if I didn't. And why it's even better for him if he didn't do it is a good question. But let's not
I've been curious about
now.
But Greg, I think it's also significant this point that Boyle makes about the difference between just bribing somebody and having the goods on them, so to speak, blackmailing them, because as we're going to discuss later in this chapter, this is the same kind of arrangement that Lillian basically proposes that she can deliver Riordan for. She says basically she's got the goods on him. We don't yet know exactly what they are, and we'll talk more about this later, but it's the same issue.
At least there's a suggestion of that, right? She can deliver him, she says, and Jim says, I wish I were as smart about my sister, and she starts to think about ways in which he might be able to do that with his sister, and it looks like she's looking for things she could blackmail her over, right? Any love affairs, all right, so with that, let's, if people have thoughts about, by the way, I've been adjusting the audio and such in response to things people are saying in the comments. Tell me if it sounds good now. Skylar, people are talking about how different people narrating the audiobook say Mouch. There are two main unabridged audiobook versions. I forget the names of the two narrators. The older one, Christopher Hurt, the earlier one, Christopher Hurt, doesn't know how to pronounce Mouch. He calls him Mooch. And Scott Brick, the newer one, pronounces it right. But Ben thinks the newer one, Scott Brick, is too hammy. I kind of like him, but we've been having this argument.
Dislike.
All right, Robert's with me, so there we go. Okay. Pooja, which one do you prefer?
Mooch and Moocher, so Mooch.
Oh, no, but we know the name is supposed to be pronounced Mouch. We were talking about which audio reader we like more. Anyway, okay, so let's go on, and we want to talk now about moving towards the wedding itself. So, Riordan. Well, they were saying it some time ago. Now I think it's been corrected. If anything, my volume's too high now. I'm near peaking. Okay, so let's talk about why Riordan's at the wedding. Now, there's been well, let me say this. Let me just mention, and then Ben, after I do this, why don't you start us off on the issue of Lillian and why Riordan's at the wedding, that we have some comments on. But just one thing left over from the last chapter that we didn't talk about, which I think we should talk about before we start talking about the Riordan, Dagny, Lillian love triangle in this chapter. We talked a fair amount about this last scene where Riordan's in Dagny's apartment and he comes there basically impotent because he's disillusioned with the world, and then by the end of the chapter he's got his vision of the world back and is turned on again, and they're going to commence with the rest of their evening. And we spent a lot of time talking about exactly what is it that leads to Riordan becoming aroused again. And my view is that, it's that he recaptures his sense of the world. That's, said in the book. And then there's the question of why exactly he recaptures his sense of the world. And we had a few things that were contributing to it. But I think that the primary factor is thinking about the inventor of the motor and looking at the way Dagny responds when they're both talking about the inventor of the motor. But the very last thing that's pointed out we didn't mention last time, and I think it's significant, so I want to make sure we mention it now, which is that in the moment of their coming together at the end of the chapter, he has a thought that's not named yet, but that's really important, which is that her greatest virtue is the thing that he had damned as her depravity. What he had damned as her depravity, her ability to experience in physical, sensual terms her view of the world, is her virtue, is what's good about her. And this is connected to his recognizing, although he doesn't quite put it in words, that his sexual feeling is connected to his own view of the world. And so I think that the fact that Riordan's had this realization in Chapter 1 is something significant, and I think it's significant to how he thinks and responds now in Chapter 2. And it's just a general point. The characters of Riordan and Dagny were relatively static in Part 1 of the novel. And there was some development, and they eventually, got together and so forth, but their basic motives and how they were acting was pretty stable. Across Part 2 and 3, we see these characters developing and changing, both of them, but particularly Riordan. And so one thing to be thinking about as we're reading the novel is how Riordan is different in this chapter from the last for each chapter, and how those differences come from things he's noticed or decided or have happened to him in previous chapters. And so we want to be tracking this progression, and I think this realization is a big part of this progression. Okay, so now he has realized this. He's sitting in his hotel room. He's thinking about how he wants to go see Dagny tonight, and doesn't seem conflicted about it. And then suddenly Lillian appears. And Ben, you want to talk about this? And
yeah, it's funny too because so of course the story that Lillian tells us, or that tells Riordan about why she wants to go to this wedding is, well, she just wants to see the most preposterous event of the season, which is already a little weird, but she's got interesting tastes. But she wants to, show off her husband to something like what it is what she's offering to him as the reason. That series of blog posts that we have occasionally talked about, the Daylight Atheist page that wrote a chapter-by-chapter commentary on this book, has an essay about this. And as with many other things in its reading of the book, it takes this at a kind of surface level and says, what's wrong with Riordan? Why doesn't he want to just go and, humor his wife, take her out, have a good time? Which might be a good question if we didn't know more about what happens in the rest of the chapter and what she reveals about her reasons for wanting to bring him here. So some of the commentators in the online discussion thought there's a little bit more going on than that. Meg, for example, said, well, she wants to be seen with her husband, but she also wants the admiration of Jim, some kind of non-material tiara, which we'll have to talk about more. What is this non-material tiara? And what kind of admiration does she want from Jim? Meg herself says she doesn't quite understand what that is or why she wants this admiration from Jim. Pooja, who's there with you now, I think, in New York, said, well, it's a lot more than that, because later in the chapter, she betrays her marriage by offering her husband as a pawn in Jim's political and social games. I mean, so we discussed earlier about how this is the political nose counting event of the year, where everybody comes to supplicate to Jim. And the idea is that if Riordan shows up at this wedding, it's in effect showing everybody else that he's somehow under the spell or in the hold of James. And Riordan doesn't realize that's what it's about. This is not the way he thinks, but it is apparently the way that Lillian thinks. Now, that still leaves unanswered the question of, why does Lillian want to do this? Why does she want to make everybody think that Riordan is under the sway of James? Why does she want to flatter James in this way? Why would she want to do that to her own husband, which is already quite different from what the daylight atheist guy thinks this is all about? And we did get some more speculation from other commentators on that. But Greg, did you want to break in at all?
It looks like some of the people in New York have thoughts on that, including Pooja, who we were just hearing from. So let's, Pooja?
I just got a crackle out of the explicit reason that Lillian states, which Dagny or Riordan would never say, but this is what she says. But that's where I want to go, because it's the most preposterous event of the season, and there isn't any other better show in town. And it's a perfectly ridiculous marriage, and all her friends have been waiting to go to it. I mean, you can't even imagine Dagny and Riordan, using these kind of reasons to go anywhere. So it's just got a crackle out of that.
Okay, so even Lillian's stated reasons are ones that Riordan would have contempt for. And I mean, she even says that you don't live by these kind of standards of feminine vanity, but it's the form of, now that's a little bit different than the preposterous event, but that she wants to be shown off there, and she wants to show him off there, and everybody will be there and so forth, because it's this preposterous event. But that's the form of any woman's happiness. That should make us think, is that true? Is it the form of any woman's happiness? And we know at least one woman, right, in Daphne, who that's not true of. And other thoughts on Lillian's motives here. Why she wants, it's clear because she says it to Jim, right, that she's manipulated him there for the very reason that Jim wants him there, namely to make it seem like he's intimidated by Jim or is seeking his favor. Why does she want to do that? Yeah, Carrie Ann?
She says it in a metaphor about the racehorse, right before that part about delivering her husband anytime to Jim. She says, from the angle of a horsewoman, darling, if you had the most powerful horse in the world, you would keep it bridled down to the gait required to carry you in comfort, even though this meant the sacrifice of its full capacity, because ... because if you let the horse go full blast, it would throw you off in no time. So she needs Jim and his henchmen to keep Hank bridled politically, so that she won't get thrown off the economic and non-material horse that she's gotten herself married to. So she just tells him very bluntly that he's useful to her for her to get the kind of values that she's seeking out of her husband.
Although it's interesting because that aspect of it comes up when Jim asks her, I'm wondering how you consider the financial side of this, that you're going to lose out financially from this. And she says this, which means, look, I'm not really losing out financially from it, because if I let him produce full hog, if I didn't keep him bridled down, he'd throw me off. So she's financially better off with Riordan shackled. But then she says, right, that the financial aspect isn't the primary thing that's driving her or the primary thing that's driving Jim. And is that the point where Jim says, I did underestimate you, Lillian? And she says, that's the tiara I was looking for. So there is something, so a part of it is even financially, she doesn't want him to leave her, but it's not just financial. Yeah.
But actually, that's the non-material tiara I wanted, was in response to him saying, Lillian, you're wonderful.
Oh, it's you're wonderful, not where she says, I underestimated you.
So he's missing
And why does he say she's wonderful? What was the prompt for that?
Balfour Bank says literature.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Balfour Bank. She says thank you. Yeah. Ben, yeah, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, she says that Balf Eubank has been looking for you, is afraid that literature won't have a place at court. So she's basically admiring him for his political pull. And he's admiring her for admiring him for this. And that's the non-material tiara. And so that relates to a point that Pooja brought up in the online discussion. Helpfully, I think she brought in the conversation that Lillian later has with Daphne about Cheryl. So this is where she's saying to Daphne, you should really give Cheryl more appreciation for what she's been able to achieve. You've never, and here I'm quoting, you've never cared to compete with us lesser women in the sole field of our ambition in the achievement of power over men. Now, there she's talking about Cheryl, but she's also saying, she's speaking in the royal we, and saying, in effect, this is what I'm after too. And I think that really helps us understand why it is that she's doing what she wants to do to Riordan. And that's the non-material tiara from Jim is being admired for her admiration of his pursuit of power, which apparently she's after also. And there's at least one other
admiration of it, though. It's also her appreciation that that's what's going on. That it's not just that Jim wants money, but that he wants to be like a big shot, right? So that he's excited when Balfour Bank needs him. And I think, Ben, that pertains to one of the things you and I were talking about earlier, because on the phone, when we were talking about Boyle is he's not at all afraid to. Well, go. Do you want to? Yeah.
Right. So earlier in the chapter, early in the scene where he's having a conversation with James Taggart, Boyle's completely openly stating, if we can't trade goods anymore, we've got to trade men. This is coming up in the context of talking about Wesley Mouch and how he's shifting loyalties and so forth.
We were talking about something that Ben and I had a discussion on over the phone, which is that Orrin Boyle is not afraid to mention the fact that they're trading men, right, rather than money, that they're basically blackmailing people and extorting them, and that's how they're doing business. He's really straight about that with Jim, and where Jim's feeling uncomfortable. So why is it that when Boyle sees the group of people hanging around Jim, Balfour Bank, and these folks, and he can see at a glance what the nature of that interaction is, he thinks, well, I guess you've got to trade something, but doesn't name to himself and doesn't care to name to himself what is being traded. He was fine with saying you can trade men and blackmail people. Why is he suddenly squeamish about what's going on between Jim and Balfour Bank? And does anyone here in New York have thoughts about what the difference is? I have a view that only just occurred to me. Anyone want to comment on that? Well, I'll just say what I think, and then we'll go back to the broader topic, which is Lillian's motives here. Boyle is someone who just wants money. He wants to get it dishonestly and so forth, but he's, I think, fairly shallow and superficial in his motivations. And I think this is something that separates Boyle from Jim and Lillian. So I don't think the conversation we just talked about, where Jim and Lillian were appreciating each other and that it's not primarily money that they're after, would go on between either of them and Boyle. Boyle just wants to get rich quick, and and what's going on in the issue with Balfour Bank and Jim, I mean, Jim doesn't need, Balfour Bank's not somebody who Jim needs financial favors from. He's not going to help corner off some industry from him. Why does Jim, what is to be traded between Jim and Balfour Bank, this kind of sleazy cultural critic and author of, crummy novels? It's something else that's being traded there. And it's something that, it's something non-material. And it's not what Boyle's after, and he feels a little bit uncomfortable and weirded out by it, I think. Okay, but let's go back to the broader topic here, which is what's going on between Daphne and Lillian and Riordan. So Lillian manipulates Riordan into going to this thing. Her motive for wanting him to go is not only what she says it is to Riordan, it's also that she wants to undermine him and make him seem like he's afraid of Jim, to help Jim, which she wants for, well, we're not sure exactly why she wants Jim to admire him. She also wants to bring him down or bridle him, as Carrie Ann pointed out, and Jim's a means to doing this. And maybe there's more to it than that. But that's what we've seen so far. How does she manipulate Riordan into going? What's the line that she takes with him? Go ahead.
Guilt that you owe it to me, you're my husband, and this is what I want to do, and you're here to...
Yeah, she guilts him into doing it. And he doesn't want to go, and he doesn't want to go. Why? Why is he resistant to going?
He doesn't want to see Daphne in public, much less in Lillian's presence.
Yeah, and in particular, he can't bear to let her see him being paraded around as the doting husband, to be shown off as her husband. It's like a treason to Daphne, and he won't let that happen. And yet, and Corey says Daphne online. So why? But he does it anyway, because he can't deny the right when it's demanded of him. And there's another issue, right? The reason of his... Ben, can you rejoin us, or are you still doing technical stuff? All right, so did you want to talk about that passage?
I'm not sure how much of it, how much of what you said about it, given that we were off for a little while. Where did you leave off? I can't hear you.
The issue of the passage on 386 as Riordan's motive.
I'm not sure which passage you're talking about. I missed something while I was.
All right,
I'll
I'll just make that point, and then we'll come back in a moment. So yeah, it says Riordan's part of the reason why he does it is because his reason for the refusal was the reason he had no right to refuse.
Oh,
that is,
right. I didn't know what that meant.
Go
that was my
because.
Question.
Oh, so say it again then.
What is the reason that for his refusal to go, such that it is the same as the reason that gives him no right to refuse? We did have a conversation about this, and I wasn't sure. I mean, I could come up with a separate reason for each of those two, and I wasn't sure how it was the same one.
Anyone here have any thoughts on that? So so Riordan goes because his reason for wanting to refuse is the reason he has no right to refuse. What is this same reason?
He signed a contract.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he signed a contract that basically from...
But that's not the reason that he wants to refuse.
He wants to refuse because
He's
Daphne's
broken
there.
the contract.
Because Daphne's there, and that the fact that he's worried about that is because of what he's doing with Daphne and the morality that he holds, that he needs to be loyal to Lillian.
And that's how I understand it. The reason he doesn't want to go is because he's having an affair because he's in love with Daphne. He's having an affair with Daphne. But the fact that he's having an affair with Daphne is his having broken his marriage vows. And his having broken his marriage vows is the reason he has no right to refuse a demand made on him by his wife, because he's sort of in the wrong with respect to their marriage, and she's right to demand things of him. So this is the context he's holding when he comes there. And this is how he's thinking about his going to the wedding, and he's not enjoying being at the wedding, and he's hating being paraded around by Lillian and shown off, and it seems trivial. This lame thing that she's getting out of seeing these crummy women try to flirt with me is like, this is what was so important to her that she dragged me here. He escapes to talk to some men, but they're all weird and he can't understand them, and one of them insults him and he doesn't know why. And so he goes off on his own and he looks at Daphne in the corner, and this is a significant moment. And Ben, this is the passage on 389 that you'd wanted to talk about?
398. Yeah.
398.
So he's in the corner thinking to himself, thinking about Dagny, thinking about everything you just mentioned, and he lost for that moment all the days and dogmas of his past. His concepts, his problems, his pain were wiped out. He knew only, as from a great clear distance, that man exists for the achievement of his desires. And he wondered why he stood there. He wondered who had the right to demand that he waste a single irreplaceable hour of his life when his only desire was to seize the slender figure in gray and hold her through the length of whatever time there was left for him to exist. And I think one of the conversations we had about this, Greg, was that this is one of the first places in the book where Riordan is really starting to reconcile with his views about morality. And it's significant that he's dropping for the moment his concepts, his dogmas, right? Because the view that he goes on to express in dropping them, the view that man exists for the achievement of his desires, is a pretty radically different view from the view of morality that he's had up until this point, which has been the conventional dogma that morality is all about, well, everything that Lillian and James and his surrounding society say it is, living for other people. And it's still, I think he still has a way to go in cashing this out. And, any old desire, but what exactly is going on here? He's radically criticizing in his mind this conventional viewpoint. And this is going to come up again in the chapter.
Yeah, and Doran has some nice points that I don't know what kind of name Doran is.
Yeah, I'm not
Male.
sure either.
That he is, I'm told male, that he's making now. Two things. I mean, one, a beautiful description. Riordan's real feelings are starting to shine through like beams through thinning clouds. And it's a nice description on Doran's part. But also that the view that Riordan's now expressing in this moment is selfishness. And Ben, that was a point you had made when we were discussing this earlier.
Selfishness or egoism, which is, of course, conventionally thought to be the antithesis of morality.
Jim
But
says it's
here
generally
it is.
agreed that anything is good so long as you don't do it for yourself, right?
This was the thing that he was trying to get Cheryl to, encourage him about, because that's Jim claims that he's never really been after profit, that he's someone who's good at loving, whereas these others are good at making profits. And it's what
Is it
everybody
mine the
has.
greater capacity?
And it's what all of society has agreed on for thousands of years. He says, "Isn't it? Isn't it?" He really wants Cheryl to, remind him that this is true.
Okay, so let's just any thoughts from the crowd here in New York about Riordan's moment of clarity and his reasons for being there? This set of issues. We want to move on next to the bracelet encounter, and then there's.
Well, I think there's one more thing we have to get
Francisco
to
say.
before that. But
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I wanted to backtrack on when Lillian, I thought you were going to cover this. Jim, she can deliver. Do we know concretely the referent there?
I take it the referent is she can bring Riordan to heel when it's necessary. I don't think Lillian or James, at least as far as the reader knows, but I don't think in fact has a particular political action. It's just she can make Riordan toe the line.
Why? Why can she make Riordan toe the line? Like, we, the reader, know this, but does Lillian know for sure?
Ben, you said you had some thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, so first of all, when we see Lillian the first time and coming into Riordan's apartment, what's she doing? Well, first of all, it's a surprise visit. Second of all, she's looking around at the ashtrays, and she even says to him, I half expected to find lipstick on those ashtrays, Henry. Remember in a previous scene where she embraced him and he felt revulsion and she was suddenly having to recalculate everything. I think you can give a pretty good argument at this point that she has reason to think he's having an affair. And she reveals this in several places, not just where she makes this halfway joke about expecting to find lipstick on the cigarettes, but also then when she's having a conversation with James and saying, yeah, Dagny's he says when she's talking about Dagny, and she's a tough one to crack. She doesn't seem to, there's no goods we have on her, no love affairs. So we know that she thinks finding that somebody is having a love affair is something that you could get, would allow you to get the goods on them. And then when she's having the conversation with Dagny herself, which is the bracelet scene, right? We get that, is this the manner in which you choose to suggest that I am having an affair with your husband? And of course not, says Lillian. But I mean, every question she was asking was implying that, and she just it's another case where she doesn't want to name the allegation that she's making.
That's true, although she doesn't believe the allegation, right? I mean,
she doesn't, and that's important. I think she believes that Riordan is having an affair with somebody. And one of the things I actually wanted to raise was why, and we can transition, I guess, to the bracelet now, because the thing that starts the conversation with Dagny about the bracelet is that Lillian looks at the fact that she's wearing the bracelet and she frowns. And she really wants it back, right? She doesn't want it to be the case that Dagny is flaunting this thing. I think that Lillian really wants Riordan to be having an affair so that she can get the goods on him, but she doesn't want it to be with Dagny, because if it's with Dagny, Dagny's not the kind of person who can be called on at any time, the kind that she refers to when she's talking with Riordan. Dagny's not a call girl. This is not a cheap, floozy, barmaid, which is the kind of girl he would be able to, she would be able to humiliate him about.
And yet, it seems like she's sincere when she says, it couldn't be with Dagny, and she later, I can't say that yet. There's stuff in later chapters about this. But it seems like she's, and the narrator tells us she's sincere, that in this shock she admits her true opinion. So I definitely agree. She suspects Riordan of having an affair. She thinks that's how she'll be able to deliver him. What she's going to deliver him for, I think she's leaving up to Jim. I think she is using the implication of an affair to try to manipulate Dagny or shame her into giving an affair with Dagny into giving the bracelet back. But she doesn't think it would be with Dagny that he's having the affair. Why is she upset at Dagny's wearing the bracelet? That's a good question. There's a lot going on in this scene with Dagny that's interesting. I want to try to get through it relatively quickly because I'm noticing the time. First of all, here we get a lot of examples of this naming versus evading facts, right? Dagny keeps not letting her get away with just kind of leaving things to implication. When she implies about the affair, Dagny says, "Is this the manner in which you choose to place and manner in which you choose to imply I'm sleeping with your husband?" And that's what, she doesn't want that named, and so she draws back like a hand of a pickpocket withdrawing, right? Yeah.
So I think that Lillian understands the significance of that bracelet, even though she kind of discarded it when it was offered to her the first time. So she knows that represents Riordan metal, and it represents the unbridled Riordan. Mm-hmm. The fact that someone's valuing it and someone who knows who's on the side of unbridling Riordan, I think that's the threat that she sees with her wearing it. Not that she's having an affair, but this is what Dagny sees Riordan for, Riordan at his best.
Yeah.
And that will unbridle him, whether it's Dagny or whether it's somebody else that sees Riordan that way. That's what she's afraid of, as being knocked off the horse, irrespective of an affair, just someone recognizing Riordan's value.
Yeah, that's very plausible.
I like that.
And that sounds, I think that, so that's very plausible, and maybe he's right. There's also, it undercuts her status in the eyes of others, that somebody else, here she is, part of what she wants to show is she's the one who has the power over Riordan, and yet here's someone else who's wearing Riordan's bracelet, and that could compromise her position as Riordan's master, in effect, or her image as Riordan's master. It also might compromise her ability to do it if Riordan's getting this kind of respect from somebody. There's also, I mean, what exactly does the bracelet represent to Riordan? Right? It represents the unbridled Riordan. I think that's right. There's something more specific that it represents. It's Riordan at his moment of triumph, wanting to integrate his personal life with his triumph. It's Riordan wanting his having created of this metal to lead to his personal happiness, or to be connected to his personal happiness. He wants to make something out of this metal for his wife. Oh, damn it, not that bitch, you know, that I'm actually married to, but who should be my wife, and that Daphne should have it fit, right? So then, well, let me just leave it at this. Daphne refuses to give it back. Lillian asks for it back. Daphne refuses. After this thing where she says, no, you know, I couldn't have meant that, Riordan says, then you will apologize to Miss Taggart. And Daphne says, no, it's not necessary. And Riordan says, it is for me in the manner of a command that can't be disobeyed. And Lillian makes an apology, but which is condescending and nasty to Riordan, incidentally. But it says, of the three of them, Daphne is the only one who knows fully what it means that Riordan took Lillian's side at the anniversary party, but Daphne's side now. So what does it mean fully?
Daphne's objectively the higher value in his own mind now, and he's not going back. He's never going back to Lillian to the extent that she had him with a chain, as she refers to it at the end of chapter 2. That's never going to happen again. And Daphne knows that.
Ben?
Yeah, I like the point that you made, Greg, about how the chain in a way represents trying to integrate both his work life and his personal life. And I thought this was a good opportunity to go back to something that I had raised earlier, back when he sees some connection. Sorry, I'm all fuzzy for some reason. There we go. He sees some connection between the guilt that he has, that he's having to hide from in his work life and also in his personal life. So he's seeing a connection there too. And I think that in this scene at the party, he also starts to shed that guilt in connection with both of these issues. And I think that's part of what Daphne is seeing that nobody else sees. In particular, in that right after that passage that I read earlier about where he's seeing man exists for the achievement of his own desires, as soon as he says that to himself, he then takes it back for a moment and he says, but you made a contract once, now stick to it. And he typically does that. He goes back and forth, and but then there's one more beat to it, because then he thought suddenly that in business transactions, the courts of law did not recognize a contract wherein no valuable consideration had been given by one party to the other. He wondered what made him think of it. The thought seemed irrelevant. He did not pursue it. Well, if he were to pursue it a little further, I think he would see that it's not irrelevant. And here's a case where he's seeing, look, you know how in business you need to have valuable consideration from the other party? Well, what about in my personal life on the other side of things with regard to this marriage contract? Has Lillian been giving me consideration? Should I then maybe not feel so guilty about it? And really I should go after my desires after all. And by the way, this point about the consideration as a requirement of a valid contract, this is from what I hear from the lawyers that I know, this is like Contracts 101. This is the thing they teach you in first year. It's a traditional doctrine in the common law. So this is pretty accurate, legally speaking.
I haven't put my voice back on. Yeah, so I mean, I do think he's not felt guilty about it in the business realm for some time, right? Because the connection was he was made to hide the Danker deal and his affair with Daphne as a guilty secret, but he didn't feel at all guilty about the Danker deal ever.
Right,
he
right,
did feel
right.
guilty about the Daphne thing, and he's now, I think, for just the reasons you're saying, not feeling guilty about it anymore. He still feels guilty about having broken his marriage vows, but not really about sleeping with Daphne, and now he's starting, the guilt about the marriage vows is starting to get holes poked in it, I think, that he owes her anything. Now, I know a lot of people online, maybe not, Doran is also a one-year lawyer, first-year law school, and studying for his contract final. Or, so, yeah. What was I about to say? What was I saying? Yeah, we want to.
You're
move
saying a
to
lot of
Francisco,
people
but-
something.
Oh yeah, a lot of people find Riordan's adultery very troubling. Right, a lot of readers of this book, and we should maybe have a special thread on that on Facebook, and maybe have an episode talking about it. A number of people have raised that point and said in the chat even last time, are all of you guys okay with this? But we haven't heard, and I don't think we have time now to do it, but we haven't heard much from, well, what is it that troubles you about this? What do you guys think about the way Riordan's processing it, the way Daphne thinks about it? There's going to be more discussion of this in Chapter 3. But for those of you who this is an issue for, let's make a thread to talk about it. I want to hear your views. Is it that you should, just how are you conceiving of it? What do you agree with or disagree with in the way Riordan conceives of it? And particularly the people who have an issue with it. There's not a point in a thread where everybody's taking Riordan or the novel side of it. I want to hear especially from the people who don't, and how you understand it.
If I could say something on this, Greg, that Daylight Atheist blog raises a point precisely in connection with this, which would be interesting to think about how Rand would answer. He says, oh yeah, you have to have consideration on both sides. And Lillian has given Riordan everything. What's Riordan given her? He doesn't give her any of his time, doesn't take her out to parties anymore. Nonetheless, he gets to sleep with her when he wants. And so it does seem like she has given him something. One question is it the relevant thing that one signs up for in a romantic relationship and in a marriage?
All right, good. So there's a thought. Let's make a thread where people can comment more on the marriage. We had one some time ago, and that might be a thing to pick up on. And Ben, maybe we can post that Daylight Atheist thing there. But let's move on to Francisco. So first of all, why is he at this wedding? Why is he here?
He's after his greatest conquest.
Well, he's after conquests. He says significantly when he's asked by Riordan, did you find any, perhaps what may be my greatest? Maybe he didn't know his greatest would be there when he went looking for conquest, but he's after conquests, whatever that means. Obviously, it's at the first level means he's looking to pick up women, but there's some kind of, Schuyler, I think, said Francisco has this I know more than you attitude about him all the time, and I think we're given to understand there's a double meaning to conquest. Yeah, Robert, why is he there?
Well, he's there to see the political climate. Jim is one reason. Jim and his henchmen are one reason, but Dagny is obviously another. He needs to know. He knows Dagny will be there. He's not sure Riordan will be there, but he knows Dagny will be there. It's her brother's wedding, so he definitely wants to get a pulse on where she stands, especially in light of the John Galt line the last time they saw each other. So I think that the fact that Riordan was there makes it even, more beneficial.
He says he didn't expect Riordan to be there.
Right.
But he must have expected Daphne to be there. Maybe he's there to do reconnaissance on Daphne. Maybe she's a conquest he's looking after. I think there's...
The last line in the chapter when he starts a panic regarding his stock. That's really what I think that was his. There's probably three meanings for conquest. The women, Riordan being just talking to Riordan as a conquest that he's trying to get up to the and that.
Yeah, I think the main reason he's there is to cause a stock panic. That's what he does there. That's his main action there. He can't be a coincidence, and he's already indicating things earlier on. Jim says, well, your work has shown, that you've not been such a party hound. Well, no, not quite yet. So it's clear he didn't do this on the spur of the moment, create a stock panic. He's there to do it, and I think that's his main reason. Robert, you mentioned his talking to Daphnes, so let's. Carrie Ann, did you want to comment on that or on another point?
Quick little point on the stock panic.
Okay.
So when he first is saying to Jim why he's there, he said, I want to thank my biggest stockholder. And so creating the panic is his amusing way of thanking his largest stockholder.
Who is Jim?
Yeah. Jim, yeah.
Smith and Gomez.
Yeah, Smith and Gomez. Okay, so he's there to.
The stock panic would have happened anyway, right? He didn't have to go there and cause it. Once the news came out, it was all going to happen. So I don't quite understand why Ayn Rand would have this character to do this when it was going to happen anyway.
But he gets to watch them panic about the impending
It's more
stock
like he's
panic.
amusing himself,
Yeah.
more than actually causing
Yeah.
the panic.
So that's a good question. And then the other element, does he really need to do this? Because things have been sabotaged, it seems, so there's going to be a panic. Anyway, so another aspect of it is his talking to Daphne that Robert raised. Yeah. And, I should just mention another big fact about it is that I don't know if this is why he's there, but he's puncturing pretenses is a big thing that he's doing there. And he's naming all the things people don't want to name. And Ben, yeah.
Yeah, Pooja had a very nice line in the online discussion about this. She said, Francisco's on a roll in naming truths in this chapter. He starts with naming, in particular, what kind of society, culture, the world of Atlas Shrugged has become, where there's now the aristocracy of pull instead of aristocracy of money / merit, which is what the chapter title, of course, is. And it's right after James says, we're going to replace the aristocracy of greed with something else. And he doesn't get to finish that line. Incidentally, I think it's interesting that when James is saying that, he's saying we're going to free our spiritual goals from slavery to greed. And that's very interesting because we've now gotten a pretty good idea of what James means by spiritual or non-material goals from this conversation with Lillian. And it's a kind of pull, which is exactly what Francisco then names.
Yeah, or at least a kind of pull is a part of it, right? And that is what Francisco is. So he's there to puncture. One of his functions there is puncturing these pretenses, naming the facts that other people don't want to name. And he says, right, that that's all it would take to blast your whole system, naming the facts. Ben, yeah, you want to read that passage out?
Yeah, on page 407, there was a time when men were afraid that somebody would reveal some secret of theirs that was unknown to their fellows. Nowadays, they're afraid that somebody will name what everybody knows. Have you practical people ever thought that that's all it would take to blast your whole big complex structure with all your laws and guns? Just somebody naming the exact nature of what you're doing, naming that James is a stockholder, naming that it's the aristocracy of pull that they're after, any number of other things that he goes on to name, including in his speech.
So this whole idea, and this is a big idea, and I think it's going to be a big idea going forward in the novel. We already started seeing it in chapter 1 of part 2, that you can accomplish something by naming the things that people are trying to avoid naming themselves. And Francisco is now saying you could blast the whole system out of existence by naming something. So we want to follow this thread of naming the things people are trying to leave nameless. And one thing you can see in the characterizations of the positive characters is they're on the track of naming things. They haven't named it yet. They're going to name, they're going to find. And the negative characters especially are people who are trying to avoid naming things. I don't think it's only them. We've seen cases in which Riordan didn't want to name or get down to the roots of things. But it's we see this difference a lot. And it's something we want to be following, particularly as we go forward through part 2. Before we talk about the money speech, and we should just say a little about that, and then discuss the rest of Francisco's relationship with Riordan. I want to get back to something Robert mentioned, which is that part of what Francisco's doing there is talking to Daphne. And Ben, you had I guess there was a passage on this, or maybe someone on the forum?
Yeah, so I mean, in line with how he's naming facts, he doesn't just do this to the negative characters. He does it even with Daphne, and they don't have a very long exchange, but he says, "Don't you want to tell me what a brilliant achievement the John Galt line turned out to be?" And she says, "I'm sorry that I am still open to be hurt. Shouldn't shock me that you've come to the stage where you despise achievement. Yes, don't I? I despise that line so much that I didn't want to see it reach the kind of end that it has reached." And suddenly she's attentive, and she realizes, man, there's something to what Francisco's saying, even though it hurt to have to realize it. And then he goes on, of course, to say, remember how you said John Galt should come and claim it. And he does.
Her reaction. How exactly is her reaction? There are two things she reacts to, right? One is saying, I hated that line so much I didn't want to see it reach the end that it did. And then the other is, you said you challenged John Galt to claim the line. Well, he has. Read the two reaction shots, so to speak, on her face from those two things, because those are really interesting.
Okay, so between those two, he saw her look of sudden attentiveness, the look of thought rushing into a breach torn open upon a new direction. He watched her for a moment as if he knew every step she would find along that road, then chuckled and said, "Don't you want to ask me now who is John Galt? Why should I want to, and why now? Don't you remember that you dared him to come and claim your line? Well, he has." And okay, here's the last part. He walked on, not waiting to see the look in her eyes, a look that held anger, bewilderment, and the first gleam of a question mark. Mike, can't hear you.
So what Francisco's doing here is raising a question for Daphne, right? He's hurting her or stinging her in a way, but in a way that tears open a breach into which new thoughts can flow, and there's the hint of a question mark. So what is the question she would have now? I mean, part of it is what's really going on with Francisco, but there's something else. Who is John Galt, Robert says. Francisco's implying that he knew what was going to happen to that line.
How it was predicted, how that...
Yeah, if this is what Francisco meant when he said John Galt was going to claim that line, then it was knowable. It's not this mysterious thing, I made this great railroad and then this happened to it. There's some reason that this had to happen, which Francisco knew about. And that means there's a mystery to be solved. It's not just some kind of accident. And that's really striking, and she had never considered that before. Now, I think it's the first hint of a question mark. I don't think she has that question fully formulated yet. We'll see it develop in her mind later. But it's the first hint that there was something to ask there. Did Francisco know this was going to happen? How could it have been known that it was going to happen? And that's big, because what Daphne is reeling in this whole part of the novel from the fact that there's something wrong with, everything's wrong, that she made this thing, it was good, this was going to save the railroad and the country, and it's all for nothing. This is, I suggested reading that story, The Birthmark by Hawthorne. It's like in that story where he creates the thing and it destroys the thing for the sake of which he created it. And the moral of that story is, well, you shouldn't aim for perfection in the world. But that's not how, is that the lesson to draw from it? There's some lesson to draw from it. What is it? And Daphne's starting to see that. Okay, so Francisco, yeah.
Going back to the stock panic, I mean, that kind of ties into the fact he's kind of there to also show her that maybe Daphne knows what he's doing and he's actually destroying his own company too. And it's the same kind of thing as the John Galt line being destroyed.
So it might be that part of why he's doing the panic this way is to, she already has guessed that he's doing some destruction deliberately. Maybe he wants to underscore that point for her, and he has some reason for wanting to tweak her in that way. That's also possible. Betsy asks, is there really a John Galt? Ben, who was it that Lauren, I guess, said one of her friends who's the first-time reader reading it has suggested that maybe Francisco is John Galt?
Yes, that was Lauren on this, on the question 6, which, yeah, I mean, if he's Galt and he had something to do with making sure that her railroad wouldn't succeed. That would be one way that he could know that this is going to happen. And we do know that he's destroying his own company. And we do know that he's been trying to sabotage all these other stockholders. So, I mean, that's a plausible theory that one could hold at this point of the book, I think.
That Galt is the destroyer, and maybe that Francisco is Galt who's the destroyer.
Yeah.
Okay, so Francisco gives the money speech. I think we can go a little later than normal tonight because we had some tech difficulties, I guess, but we don't want to go too much later. And we've talked a lot about the money speech in the whole session we had on it. Are there, what I think we should talk about now, if we're going to talk about it, is we talked there about the content of the money speech. Let's talk now about it as a speech act, as something that occurs in the novel, that a guy comes to a party and gives this speech with certain other people in attendance. He says he's speaking to Riordan, right? Now that can't be, and I think, Ben, you pointed it out, that can't be literally true in, like, that all the second person statements in the speech refer to Riordan, because
right.
You pointed out, go ahead.
There's a place, for example, where he says if you make production evil, you can't blame anybody else. You're the one who's destroying the world. And I think that's aimed at the looters. And there's other statements like that.
I don't think
Can't hear you. Good.
He's talking so that Riordan will hear him. But part of what he wants Riordan to hear is him addressing the looters. Maybe some of it he's addressing Riordan directly. And that's an important... He wouldn't be giving this speech if Riordan wasn't there. But he's giving it for Riordan to hear him, and maybe in part he's addressing Riordan, and in part maybe he's giving Riordan an example of how other people are to be addressed. He said, Ben, as you pointed out earlier, I want to give you the words in the hope that you'll remember them for some time when you need them, and
Yep.
maybe he's
Yep.
giving Riordan kinds of words that he can use. There are a lot of good comments that were made in response to the question about how Francisco's speech sums up or characterizes events in the novel that have already occurred. And I've mentioned earlier this idea that the speeches, each one that you get, and I think the Daphnes reflections while she's writing the John Galt line are a speech, or count like a speech for this purpose, are kind of summing up some of the essence of what we've seen up to this point in the novel. And then henceforward, characters are going to have that summing up in their minds, driving this new way of conceptualizing what happened. And I think that's right. I think we shouldn't spend too much time on the events that concretize it because of where we are in time. But Ben, are there one or two that you think are particularly worth bringing out?
One or two. How to choose? Well, Pooja had a really good one, which was that, I mean, the first point that Francisco makes, that the first root of money is production. You can see this all over the place in Starnesville, where there is no money, where, Riordan tries to offer money to the man who's pulling water from a well, I think, and he doesn't want it. It's no good for him because they just barter, and they don't even have too much to barter, right? Because there are no goods, because there are no producers. Everybody has left town. So that was I think that's a good example of a world without money. That's an example of what it looks like to free people from the rule of the dollar. Is this the world that James Taggart wants? I also thought it was interesting, just my own observation. So there's two big steps. First, what's the root of money? It's production. Then what's the root of production? And basically it's the rational mind. And it's very interesting to look at some of the examples that Francisco gives when he's making this point. Take a look at an electric generator and tell yourself that it was created by the muscular effort of unthinking brutes. And then later, wealth is the product of a man's capacity to think. Then is money made by the man who invents a motor at the expense of those who did not invent it? And of course, we already know about the motor and how it was left in this factory by these brutes who didn't appreciate its value, much less how it was going to work. And we know that there was some lone genius who had to discover some new principle of physics to make this work. And this is symbolic of any number of different kinds of productive achievements that required the use of the mind.
Could be just
those
that
are two.
Francisco's using a motor as a salient example of an achievement. If he has in mind this particular motor, that would mean that he has to know about it. And we don't know yet whether he does, so that's a good question. And if he does know about it, is he referring to it just because it's a salient example to him, or does he know that Daphne and Riordan know about it, and he thinks he wants Riordan to hear him talking about a motor? I don't know. I mean, how would he know that Daphne and Riordan, it's a secret? I don't know that, have they told anyone about it? It's a good question. So that's...
She's told Axton about it.
Daphne is told Axton that she was searching for a motor, and Stadler. And so maybe Axton or Stadler could have told Francisco. They were his teachers. They don't talk to each other, it seems, anymore. And Stadler seems to have contempt for Francisco now. We don't know about, Axton, I think, says he was proud of him, but we don't know that they're in touch. Although Francisco knows that he's alive, because that came up at the earlier, so maybe interesting.
Greg, I think I want to give at least two more quick examples of points that people made from the comments, because some of these are really good.
Sure.
One was Harry's, who cited the passage where Francisco says, "The man who attempts to purchase the brains of his superiors to serve him with his money, replacing his judgment, ends up by becoming the victim of his inferiors. The men of intelligence desert him, the cheats and frauds come flocking." And Harry argues this has got to be an illustration of the very point about that we're about to see demonstrated, where everybody thinks they can just buy Francisco's brains by investing in his company, but they haven't put in any thought to it. The old-fashioned investors who care to put thought into it deserted a long time ago, and now it's just these modern types like James Taggart. So that's one point. And then in the very next paragraph, interestingly, and this is my own observation, Francisco discusses the issue of inherited wealth, which he's the heir, who's the playboy heir, and so it's odd that he should be saying only somebody who's earned, who's fit for his money will be able to keep it. It's odd he should be saying it when he's the playboy. And another person online,
and he's not succeeding at keeping it, right? He keeps losing money.
Right. Oh, yes. And then Pooja, who's scoring a lot of points tonight, mentioned that Lawson and Hunsaker proved the point about this from the speech about the man who damns money has obtained it dishonorably, while Daphne, Riordan, and Francisco proved the point that the man who respects it has earned it. Well, but of course, Francisco looks like the worthless heir. There is another heir to a fortune in this room, however, that he may also have in mind. Do you look at money and you cry that money has corrupted him? Did it, or did he corrupt his money? Well, what about James Taggart?
Is the one that we see saying money is the root of all evil, or one of the ones that we see
Right.
saying it. And of course, we've met another set of worthless heirs now that we're talking about this motor that are connected to it, which are the Starnes heirs. And Ivy Starnes is all anti-materialism, anti-money now. And
if you notice, at one point, Francisco says it says something about the man who would sell his soul for a nickel. Which is
good
exactly
point.
what Gerald Starnes does, right? When he's a bum and he steals the nickel from the bum next to him. I don't think that Francisco would actually know about that example, but he offered it.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
No, just my favorite quote of the speech. So here it is. The men who live by force yet count on those who live by trade to create the value of their looted money are the hitchhikers of virtue. Mm-hmm. In a moral society, these are the criminals, and the statutes are written to protect you against them. But when a society establishes criminals by right and looters by law, then the race goes not to the ablest at production, but to those who are most ruthless at brutality. When force is the standard, the murderer wins over the pickpocket. And then the society vanishes in a spread of ruins and slaughter. It's an inversion of.
So, and Francisco thinks that that's happening to this society. So if that's true, or he's suggesting it, Ben says we can see it happening here at this meeting, in Taggart and Mouch, you say?
Yeah, I mean, Taggart is the one who thought he was on top of the world, and now all of a sudden he's finding there's a bigger dog on the block, who's not as sophisticated as he is, and we'll have to see how that develops.
Yeah, if this is Francisco's right, we should anticipate more brutality, though. So if Mouch has just gotten one over on Jim, we don't yet know that he's a more brutal kind of guy than Jim. So either he should prove to be a more brutal character than Jim, and maybe we'll see that that's the case, or somebody else will turn out to dominate or run Mouch, maybe, or in Boyle, or maybe someone else who we should expect to be more brutish than him. And so we should just keep an eye out for who's dominant, and if Francisco's right, we should see it going to like thuggish types of people eventually. And we haven't seen that yet, I don't think. Ferris and Stadler. Now, Stadler's not thuggish as well, but Ferris is maybe thuggish.
Ferris is.
He's, well, we'll see.
Okay.
Let's see if he is, and see who comes. All right, so let's talk about, Taylor, you're quoting something from a couple of chapters from now. So, Pooja, Corey says you're rocking. And Jonathan's commenting us. Well, complimenting us all. Okay, but I want to talk about what goes on with Riordan and Francisco after the speech. I think this is a really big encounter. So, first of all, we had a question about the signs that these two people are really important to one another, have become really important to one another. And I'll just say, just in the interest of time, what I think the major two are, and I think these both did come out in our discussions of it. Riordan, we see Riordan thinking about how much he's thought about Francisco and what he wanted from seeing him. And Riordan says, you're going to get a lot of admissions from me. That speech was what you were offering me when you said you were offering me gratitude, and it was more than gratitude, and I needed the gratitude. I can't imagine all the things it's given me, and it'll take me days to work out what they are. So we should expect to see things from this speech coming out in Riordan's behavior and thought in the future. Riordan's telling us that, right? But also that Riordan's bothered by how Francisco can be wasting a mind like his. So Francisco's really important to Riordan. And Riordan says, I don't know if you ever gave a damn about anything. And Francisco asks him if he has any Riordan metals, any Danconia copper stock, and then says, we don't know why this should be the thing to say, but someday you'll know what a treason this is that I'm committing, and you'll know if anyone or anything ever did mean anything damn to me and how much he did mean. So he's saying, Riordan, you mean enough to me that I'm going to commit some kind of a treason for you. And then the treason is telling him not to buy any stock in his company. So why that is a question. But we're having Francisco say, you mean a lot to me, enough to me that I'm betraying something for you. So this is some real kind of serious connection between these two people that we're seeing. But what else goes on between them here? What else significant happens between them in this scene after the speech? Thoughts, Pooja?
So this is completely heart-wrenching to me when they first start to talk, So Riordan is kind of extending a hand of friendship to Francisco by saying things like, I've thought about you more than I care to admit. Or I wish I could like you, as much as I really do. And then obviously Francisco goes ahead and talks to him about how he has set up the looters. or the Danconia copper,
The hitchhikers.
the stockholders, and how he set them up, and how there's going to be a rock slide, or the fire and stuff like that, and the way it ends is that Riordan comes back and comes back and says things like, "You are the guiltiest man in the room, and you're worse than I had supposed." And basically, you see Riordan's, face as if a great hope kind of died, And this is just so heart-wrenching.
It is heart-wrenching, but it's also not the end of the encounter.
No.
So, and it's significant because just after that, Riordan sees Francisco do something, and he thinks, I had thought I was ruthless, but the man who's capable of this is a giant, whatever else he is. So, but let's roll back the frame a little bit to earlier in the conversation, because I think there's something else we need to make sense of that whole exchange. Carrie Ann, is this on something earlier or later?
No, it's in the conversation.
No, I mean the earlier part of it, or, well, go ahead, whatever it is.
Yeah, it is in the earlier part of it, where Francisco explains to Hank why he should not have appeared at the wedding.
Okay.
Because Hank does not understand, because I think that Francisco is basically getting at is that he uses the term sanction as though he were operating with them as they were civilized, that there's a moral equivalence between the way in which the two operate. And he needs to draw Hank's attention to the fact that they're not moral equivalents.
Good.
And it's dangerous for him to let people perceive that he believes they're morally equivalent.
Yeah, so
Hank's totally blind to.
Hank already has this idea of sanction being an issue. Riordan, I don't know whether Francisco can know that yet, that Hank's been thinking all this terms, but it's interesting that Francisco puts it in those terms for Hank, which is different terms than Lillian and those people see it. So that's interesting. But then what happens is there's the fool woman, right, who says to Francisco, I don't agree with you, but it's just that I feel you're wrong, so I don't feel you're right, so I know you're wrong. And he, is nasty to her, right? But what Riordan says is, I feel like I think you're one way, Francisco. I think you're contemptible, but I can't feel it. I feel, I don't understand it. I like you a lot, but I shouldn't, right? I feel just like that fool woman. And what Francisco says here is really significant, and this is an important, Ben, do you have this passage on hand? So you're making the same mistake as that fool woman passage?
I do. Yeah, that woman and all those like her keep evading the thoughts which they know to be good. You keep pushing out of your mind the thoughts which you believe to be evil. They do it because they want to avoid effort. You do it because you won't permit yourself to consider anything that would spare you. So we've been talking much of the evening about different thoughts that characters are evading. And there have been other cases more in previous chapters where Riordan would push things out of his mind, but it's always of a different nature. And you saw that tonight when first he says, I exist for my own desires, I want to go be with that woman, but you signed a contract, push that thought out of your head. So he's pushing it out because he thinks it's evil. But then Francisco has more to say. But
there's a really significant thing that comes after this, where we see him pushing a thought out of his head. Right? So the main thought we've seen him push out of his head before this chapter, and struggle never to name the root of it, because he couldn't see the root of it, was whatever it was that made him laugh triumphantly at the Wyatt fire. And when he says to Francisco, aren't you like these people, these people of the double standard, you're growing rich off directives? And Francisco says, no, I didn't do that. It's the hitchhikers that did it. And Riordan says, you can never prove that. You don't know how much I want to believe you. And he says, I can prove it to you right now. And he tells him that he's basically sabotaging the business. And Riordan again laughs triumphantly. And he thinks it's the same as the Wyatt fire. And when he comes back to reality, Francisco's been looking at him, right? And this is the scene where Francisco says what Pooja pointed out before, you're much worse, blah, blah, blah. And what Francisco says is there are no evil thoughts, Mr. Riordan, except the refusal to think. So what's going on in this moment is whatever happened to him over the Wyatt fire issue is something he's been not dealing with, right? And Francisco's saying, yeah, this is that again, and Riordan knows this is that again, and this is the thought you have to face. Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, and it's the second time that he said that something about the refusal to think. Just a couple of pages before, right after the one that I read before about the two different kinds of thought suppression, Francisco says, any refusal to recognize reality for any reason whatever has disastrous consequences. Don't ignore your own desires, Mr. Riordan. Don't sacrifice them. Examine their cause. There's a limit to how much you should have to bear. And here's this issue of egoism again. The same thoughts that Riordan had kind of named for himself earlier on when he was thinking about Daphne, saying man exists for the achievement of his own desires. Francisco is saying something quite like it here. Don't ignore your own desires. Don't sacrifice them. And he'd named it in his speech as well, after talking about how the mind was the root of money. He also talked about that presupposed the axiom that every man is the owner of his mind, and that money demands of you the recognition that men must work for their own benefit, not for their own injury. So I think these are some of the most important words that Francisco is finally giving to Riordan.
Yeah, that seems right. And so there's the two issues of the egoism, different ways in which that's coming forth. And then, importantly, also this idea of no evil thoughts. So he first names this no evil thoughts except the refusal to think issue in connection with saying Riordan's making the same mistake as the fool woman. Then there's when Riordan has the moment of triumphant laughter and Francisco saying this is an element of it. And we know that this has been happening with Riordan more than once. This is his second major attack of it. And so Riordan's naming this, Francisco's naming this as an instance of it. And there's one other major question that Francisco raises as a hint to what's going on with him, because part of what's puzzling Riordan is, Francisco, how can you talk this way and seem this way as a person and yet lead this kind of life as a playboy? And Francisco gives as a hint, you expect him to say as his hint, check your premises, but instead what he says, or I consider you think again, or suggest you think again, but what he says as a hint is, if what I said is true, who's the guiltiest man in this room? And at first Riordan doesn't know. After Francisco says this business about deliberate destruction, he says, I think it's you, Francisco. But what Francisco says is it's not Jim Taggart. Presumably Francisco doesn't think it's himself, Francisco. And Riordan has to identify the man and the guilt on his own. So this is another lead or suggestion or something that Francisco's giving. Well, we are now... one other thing that I want to point out before we go on to... Well, before I say what I was going to say. In precipitating the crash in the room, one of the things that's pointed out, and I think this goes with is the way in which the mighty puffed up looters are immediately toppled and made to crumble. And that's just an element of it that's really stressed, and I thought, and that Riordan takes some satisfaction in, I think, in seeing. Yeah, Alex?
So I think Riordan's main conquest that he had was he was able to name the truth that the looters weren't able to.
Francisco's conquest, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
He was able to name the truth, name the moral basis of what the looters are doing, and he was able to bring everything to a standstill by saying that, by explaining that the stock was going to crash.
So this is a conquest. Perhaps this is the conquest he was referring to when he said, Riordan asked, have you found any conquest? And he said, I think what's going to be my greatest. Perhaps this conquest at the party of bringing the party to a halt is what he's saying was his greatest. We'll have to check on that later to see if he has any greater conquest that he may be referring to. But it's a big deal, and it's destroying a large part of his company. And we've already gotten the sense that he wants to do that. So we're over time now. I think we're over about the amount of time that we lost. with the technical difficulties, we have not yet talked about one major issue we wanted to talk about, which is Jim and Cheryl's relationship. I think we should not try to go ahead and talk about it now. Maybe we could do a supplemental episode on that, Ben, you and I, at some point, and get people in on it, or I'm not sure. Do you have any suggestions?
I would be okay with doing one, but maybe we could just give a tidbit on this issue. I mean, the big question that we were wondering about, that a lot of people posted about in answer to, was why does Jim want to marry Cheryl? And you get
So
a
let's
lot.
take like 5 minutes on this.
Yeah. Well, let me sum up a bunch of comments without actually reading them. There was a kind of series of suggestions people made about what he might be going for. Greg, a different Greg, and Meg both made points about how, well, at first you might think he's trying to help out Cheryl in life, but that doesn't seem right because he doesn't seem sincere about it often. He's kind of smiling at her uncertainty and presenting her in a kind of mocking way to her friends. Maybe it's just that he wants to get admiration from his friends, but then why does he want this admiration, especially when these people know that this is all BS, is what a lot of people pointed out in the online discussion. And it's especially interesting to think about, why does he want this all from Cheryl and not some other person like Betty Pope, who comes up briefly for the last time? What is it that Cheryl in particular gives him? And a number of people had interesting comments about, well, there's something that there's something about the way Jim approaches this where it's not just admiration that he wants, it's that the fact that these people are willing to play along in his game suggests to him that their kind of consensus is helping make something true. They're helping him to fake something. The example of Caligula's horse here comes up, which is a friend makes an offhand comment about, this is the case where Caligula makes his own horse a member of Senate, and the rest of the Romans have to go along with him. I'll just leave it with one last point, which is that I think it's the comments that we get from the sob sister is really significant. And Amish, who's in the audience with you, pointed this out, I think. I think there's a lot more to say. I mean, it sounds like what the sob sister is giving Cheryl is really good advice. And it might not just be good advice. There might be some hint of an explanation here as to why James wants to marry Cheryl. This is on page 392, and what she says is...
Maybe, Amish, do you want to comment on that since you're here?
Sure. So I think she says something to the effect that people who don't go at you for your faults, but for your virtues, and to beware of them because they're much more dangerous to you when they come calling.
Yeah, and one thing we might think about is why she's saying this. Ben, you say there's a little more in the passage, so why don't you listen up?
Yeah, and I think the really significant part that I didn't even notice until this last reading, but there are people who try to hurt you through the good they see in you, knowing that it's the good, needing it, and punishing you for it. Why would somebody punish you for the good that they know that they need? Could this relate somehow to what James is doing with Cheryl?
And that the sob sister is saying this, right? The sob sister has become sort of friendly with Cheryl, and Cheryl's telling her stuff about their relationship. Oh, the first time Jim came here, oh, but I didn't think this, and he... So the sob sister has some insight into what's going on. Presumably she knows what we've been narrated about the past of their relationship. And if the sob sister's saying this to Cheryl, it's presumably not some idle advice. Here's one interesting thing the sob sister's learned about life that she wants to pass on. She presumably thinks it's relevant advice to Cheryl, and you can see she says like, sometimes when she says, oh, Jim did this because he's such and such. She seems to see through Jim and to see that Cheryl's reading of him isn't the right reading. He is one of these people who hurts you through not just your virtues, but the virtues they see in you, right? Knowing, and then this point that Ben added, knowing that they're your virtues and needing them. So the Sob sister thinks Jim is like that, presumably, and thinks that she could see in what Jim has done that he's like that. Now, whether that's the right read on Jim and what about him that we've seen so far could indicate that. Pooja?
One quick point. So this is when Jim has brought Cheryl to the party, and everybody's wondering who she is. So I'm quoting here. She saw an odd smile on Jim's face when he answered. So he lets them know that she's a sharp girl who works at a cosmetics counter. Then she saw some people becoming too polite to her and others moving away in a pointed manner, and most of them being senselessly awkward in simple bewilderment, and Jim watching silently with that odd smile.
Yeah, so this is what Jim wants. And what is it that he wants? These people to feel confused? Her to feel however it is that she feels because of this? Is this what the Sob sister is reacting to? How would this be hurting her through the good he sees in her? What is it that he needs? I think we should just leave these as open questions. And we're really out of time, so let's end here, although there's a lot more we can say. So I think, Ben, let's not do, because we wanted to do a supplemental episode as a spoilers episode, and I think now is a really good time to do it because we haven't done one in a while, and I think there's a lot to say about these chapters from a spoiler perspective. So let's try to find the time later in the week to do that. Let's leave the Cheryl questions and Cheryl and Jim questions to when we next meet them in the novel. And with that, any last thoughts for tonight? I meant from Ben, but yeah, Pooja.
No, I just like the way Riordan reacts to Francisco's coming in, and he's looking for amusement and hope and excitement, and if that's not love, I don't know what it is.
Can I say something?
Well, everybody wants to talk. All right, go ahead, Robert.
Just the weekend that Ayn Rand died, this is March 1982, there's a Unitarian church on Central Park West and 77th that I used to always walk by, and it had that quote from Francisco, "There are no evil thoughts except the refusal to think." And I was like really depressed that she was dead, and then I saw it on this church, so I had a big smile on my face for that.
And no iPhone camera to take a picture.
Not in 1982.
Here we go. All right, Ben, last thoughts for tonight?
I think the mystery about the cigarette is very interesting. We haven't talked about that. It's a quick throwaway line, but this cigarette guy in the train station has discovered an impossible cigarette. And, well, we know that Dagny got it from Axton, and we know that Axton knows the inventor of the motor. What's going on? Your mic is off.
What's impossible is that it couldn't have been invented anywhere on Earth, or couldn't have been made anywhere on Earth, and yet it was made and is on Earth. So, all right. More on this and the perhaps extraterrestrial cigarette next time.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.